Awesome, Grace. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me today and share your story with everyone. So let's just start all the way back, kind of maybe high school or kind of going into college. I think we met before your freshman year. Was that right?
Yes, I think it was the summer before my freshman year of college.
So that was like 2019 or right?
Yes, summer of 2019.
Seems like ages ago, but okay. So let's just give the listeners a little bit of background in terms of like where you're from. I think you were almost had like more of a healthcare oriented type of resume where you had done some really cool things in like the John Hopkins Youth Advisory Council, stuff like that. And then were you coming into school to mean like, I know I want to go investment banking or finance? What was the thought?
Yes, I had kind of discovered finance accidentally throughout high school, just from some books I read, but I didn't really know anyone personally in the industry. Mm-hmm. So I did know, of course, that who you know is very important in being able to get a job in college. So I came in with the idea that I wanted to start meeting people right away in the industry. And I also knew that kind of within the world of finance, there's a lot of different paths that you can go down, of course. And so I was eager to just kind of start figuring out what some of those paths were and which of those interested me the most. So I think I came in with a lot of energy and initiative. And then I just kind of needed to figure out my direction a little bit, as most freshmen do, of course. So I was ready to hit the ground running. But I've just kind of
you weren't like definitely finance, but you were like definitely you were saying I definitely want to explore it, right? Is that kind of
I think I was pretty set on something within finance in the broadest sense of the word, or how you would think of the industry. Yeah. But I also knew that I kind of knew what investment banking was. I knew what trading was, but beyond that, I didn't really know exactly what those other paths were out there.
Yeah. And so I remember we kind of, when I first met you and we talked to see if you'd be a good fit, I think right away I noticed like you had a lot of energy, which is great. And I think the thing we look for the most, I think, is people who are ready to put in the work. And you were able to communicate, show that you had a track record of like doing really well in school. And so I thought you'd be great to work with and have as a mentee. So can you talk a little bit about kind of how that started out and give people a little perspective on like how things progressed for you?
Mm-hmm, definitely. And I think the first part of that, at least I remember kind of the fall of my freshman year, most of our conversations were really centered around the networking piece. Mm-hmm. Because as I said, I recognized the fact that there was so little that I actually knew about what was out there. So I was ready to learn more about it and talk to people who have gone down all these different paths. And I think like working with you really helped me kind of formalize my approach and figure out, okay, like I know there's all these things out there. How do I even begin to try to approach like learning about this, building up contacts, and then also doing so in the most efficient way, because you can do it in a very inefficient way.
Oh yeah.
And in that case, you're not really going to be able to reap the benefits of it. So I felt like, working with you, were able to give me a lot of advice on like the soft skills side, of course, but then also just in terms of making my approach a lot more systematic, I think. So that way I was able to kind of scale what I was doing, not to make it sound too impersonal, of course, but to scale what I was doing in a sense. And I think especially what I did that freshman fall and really kind of into the beginning of COVID, even like the next semester when all of that was hitting, I felt like I had such a good foundation built of people I had spoken to. And so at that point, then like over the next year, when I was reaching out to people, it wasn't to talk for the first time. It was to catch up and follow up. And I'd already formed a relationship with them, which really has then just continued to compound. And kind of how how my relationships with a lot of the people I spoke with at this point, almost 4 years ago, have grown. And I'm still a student right now.
It's awesome. Yeah. So I think one of the things that struck me was you were very like coachable. You're very much like, okay, tell me what to do, tell me what to say. And that's ideal because like you weren't reinventing anything, but you were following a system that works. So you actually did make the connection requests. You did write like you did try to make it personal. You didn't just like blast like thousands of people. And I think that showed, because I think you were getting upwards of like several hundred connections at one point when you were really pushing hard, like a week,
yes,
something like that. And you were getting,
I was having so many phone calls each day.
A lot. Like what would you say is at the peak? What were you doing? Like 5 phone calls a day or something like that? Crazy.
I would say, yeah, it probably came close to maybe like at its peak, like 18 a week, maybe.
Oh, wow.
Around that.
That's a lot. But that
So
shows that like your funnel was working, like to get
yes.
connections and build relationships. And so how did that, so okay, this is freshman year. This is a huge advantage to all of you listening. If you can start freshman year, I know everyone's like, you have time to figure it out, but like people are recruiting sophomore year now. So really, if you can lay that foundation freshman year, or at least early sophomore year, it's a huge advantage. So what happened? So you kind of building these relationships, you're doing all these calls by like middle of freshman year, freshman spring. And, when do you start actually recruiting? You try to just get some sort of any internship, right? Like for that.
Yes. And kind of in tandem with all of the outreach that I was doing to professionals in the field, I was really just also doing everything I could to especially talk to seniors at the time. So people that were 3 years above me on campus, and then like really building out contacts there, and just of course like getting myself involved on campus kind of goes into parallel with that. And so because of that and some connections that I made there, I was able to get an internship the winter of my freshman year. Being in the city for school, I was able to go in person to the office a couple days a week doing that internship.
To be fair, you were in the city, which is a huge advantage, but you're at a non-target.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So
and so
it's like, it's a balance, right? I think it probably is equal to being like a semi-target somewhere where you're not, like in terms of how easy or hard it makes it. But yeah, by no means there wasn't like a path laid out for you to get into high finance. It was very much you had to make your own path. There was a few people in banking from your school, but it wasn't like, it wasn't like you're coming from an Ivy League school or an NYU where they're just like sending hundreds of kids every year. It was more like a sprinkling, right?
Right, exactly. I'd say, and Fordham's a small school to begin with also. So
yeah.
Even though we do have a decent alumni base at this point that's kind of slowly grown over the last decade, it's only really at a lot of the bulge bracket banks. You haven't seen Fordham break in as much at places like PJT or Evercore.
Yeah,
so there's a distinction there, and that's kind of and then like also like where I ended up, BlackStone, there's almost no Fordham alumni, very few. And so I think a lot of what enabled me to start getting those getting exposure to places like BlackStone, like some of the boutique investment banks, like Evercore, that I otherwise would not have been able to, was because of but the experience that I was able to get from those early internships. And then kind of alongside that, because I'd started networking so early, and on one hand, I just had more connections overall because I was networking not only with people from Fordham or Fordham alumni, but I also figured out that I could reach out to people who I had other commonalities with. I found people who were also from Baltimore. And so I was able to break into a few places that way, into the pipelines at a few places where there were no Fordham alumni, just from sending cold emails to people who I could find who had their high school listed on their LinkedIn profile. And so I was able to find some Baltimore natives that way. Things like that all kind of came together to allow me to have a pretty good range of options when it came time for some recruiting for my junior summer.
So when you started that, and that happened as early as sophomore year, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about that. So you're getting into sophomore year, you have the summer internship, so your resume is already stacking, looking good because you got something freshman summer that's somewhat related. We're actually going to be, for WSO Academy, you guys actually are going to get an internship with WSO that's very relevant finance research internship. So it looks good on the resume. It helps stack your resume in their favor, just like you did. And so what happened kind of coming in sophomore year, going into recruiting cycle? You were not dropping your resume on campus, right? So how are you even getting into these processes? You said you started reaching out to people as you got onto campus sophomore year?
Yes. Yep. And then so sophomore year, as I was especially like checking in with people, kind of doing these like catch up conversations with a lot of people that I had initially reached out to a year earlier as a freshman. I was also kind of at the same time, because of those conversations and then just my own initiative, aware of a lot of these sophomore programs that a lot of the banks do now. Some of them are diversity focused, others are just general sophomore insight programs. Yep. And the more and more so every year, some of those programs begin in the fall of your sophomore year, not even in the spring. So my first formal program that I did with BlackStone was actually in the fall of my sophomore year. And I think the reason it was a very competitive program, I think the acceptance rate technically to that program was lower than the actual internship acceptance rate, just because of how few people were accepted into that program that I did. And it was one of these 2-day kind of insight programs. got to hear from people from all
How
different
low?
parts
How
of the firm.
low would you say the acceptance rate? Like under 5% or something?
It was definitely, I know the summer internship that I did there was less than a 1% acceptance rate.
Jeez.
And I'm pretty sure I remember calculating.
Wait, you mean from intern to full-time offer? Or no?
I mean, in terms of people who applied for the internship.
Under 1%. Yeah, it's insane.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's at the point, it's like a numbers game when you're applying to all these different places. But for the Insight program that I did, I remember it was a group of about 30 people. And I think at least a third of them were from just Harvard, Yale, and Wharton. And
you're like, I'm here. Hi.
So I remember feeling really good about the fact that I was able to make it into that program. And while I can never know for sure, I'm pretty sure a large reason why I was accepted into that was because there were 2 Fordham alumni at BlackStone at the time who I began forming really good relationships with from the fall of my freshman year, about a year earlier. So at that point, I'd had multiple conversations with both of them, and they had told me that they had flagged my resume to HR. And so I think that was probably a pretty substantial factor in allowing me to be accepted, since I wasn't, of course, coming from one of the schools that they typically receive a large amount of candidates from.
Yeah.
And so then being a part of that program is what got me into then an accelerated pipeline for the rest of recruiting. And so at that point, it was a combination of the experience I had on my resume.
Yeah.
And then also, I think one thing that people might not talk about as much, but one of the other benefits from doing a lot of phone calls, just from recruiting early, is you learn pretty early on like how to have a phone conversation and just how to be able to talk with anyone, especially if the person on the other end of the phone isn't being super talkative, and how to carry on a good conversation, which might sound very
think back
simple.
To your freshman year, like first 5 calls, and then think to like your junior year, like what the difference is it like crazy? There's like,
it is crazy. And the way I think about it, some of those early freshman calls were me kind of getting over that hump of, having really awkward conversations, just not knowing how to really carry a good conversation.
Yeah.
So because of that, I think that was something that I carried with me, not only into additional recruiting when it was more directly attached to interviews, but then also in the interviews themselves, especially because most of my interviews were on Zoom, where I think, the verbal aspect is even more important, because you're not, you can't really focus on body language as much as you would in person. So I think that really helped me stand out in interviews. And at least for me, I felt like on my end, I didn't come off super nervous in most of the interviews I was doing. I felt like, especially in the BlackStone interview process, that I was really able to be successful in that, because I came into the interviews with a lot of energy. And I was just, I think I was good at communicating that I was so excited to be there, and kind of demonstrating that enthusiasm for the role that I was interviewing for, which again, it might sound really small, but I think those are some of the things that make the biggest difference when you're competing against so many other people.
You had the reps, and I know we did a lot of calls, but it was, some of ours were like focusing on the technical interview questions, which are important to know, but it was like the skill set that you brought for the behavioral and the fit questions and the way you held yourself. Like, I think that's really what sets the good or great candidates from the exceptional ones, the ones that get in when the acceptance rate is under 1%. You have to be able to carry yourself incredibly well. You need to be well-spoken. You need to know your story really well, which after doing 100 or 200 calls, you're like, basically, you can focus all on the delivery. It's no longer, you're not searching in your head for like the right answer. You know what you're going to say. So it's all about delivery. You can focus on like their body language. You can focus on like how they're, responding to your answer. So I think, I saw that maturity, kind of that evolution while we were working together, like really fast. I think by the end of freshman year, you were even much more confident than when we started. And then I think, by end of sophomore year, you were already kind of off to the races, and it was awesome to see. So technical interview questions. I remember doing a mock.
Yes.
Some mock. Tell me about that, because I thought the first one we did, I thought it was good, but I was like, we need to tighten up some of these things, right? And so I think you did that though, right? You went back and you drilled. So talk a little bit about that, and like, did it come in handy ever, or was it pretty straightforward?
It absolutely came in handy. And I think for me personally, I'm someone who studies and learns very independently and just by reading a lot. And so then being in a setting where I was in a conversation and a back and forth, a mock interview was what allowed me to really identify some of the weak points that I had in my understanding of certain concepts that I would not have otherwise recognized in just going through myself, even in testing myself with flashcards. I think then when you're testing yourself on not only your knowledge of the concepts, but also your ability to then communicate them and the delivery aspect, again, that makes a huge difference, because even if you feel like you have it all down on paper, if you can't communicate that to the interviewer, then it's kind of pointless.
I can tell you, when we interview potential instructors for our B2B business, for our training business, we have people from like the top banks, like you're talking Goldman here, private equity, incredible stats, and then they know WAC, but then try to actually like theoretically explain it. A lot of them stumble because you have to be, it's one thing to like know the concept and be able to like understand it internally. And then it's a totally different skill set to be able to verbalize it. And getting that real life practice, I think, is absolutely critical, so that you're not just the behaviorals, but the technicals. You're just you're gliding through them, and it's more about like your energy. It's more about the presence that you're giving off kind of in the interview room, which I think you probably, after all those calls, it was just like you said, you weren't nervous because you had done so many interviews. Really, like these informational interviews are in a way an interview. And so you had so many reps. So, okay. So what was the outcome? Or actually, before we even get there, like, what do you think was the most helpful thing that we worked on, like from the beginning?
I think there's two sides to that. One is the networking. Again, like you really helped me with the approach to take to that, in being able to kind of scale what I was doing. And then also just doing that very early on, kind of working with you in a kind of more formal way also kept me accountable with it. And then that way too, it forced me to really think back. Before we spoke, I think we were probably checking in with each other every week or two at that point. Before every conversation, it really forced me to think about, okay, who have I spoken with this week? And like kind of what are my takeaways from these conversations that I've had in a way that I probably otherwise would not have been forced to do.
You knew we were going to be like, what are you doing now? If you didn't,
right. And it was so good. I'm so appreciative of that looking back. And
accountability, it's big because it's hard to like motivate. It's actually, it's very intimidating when you're young to get on the phone call with these professionals that, you don't think they want to talk to you. A lot of them want to talk to you. That's the thing a lot of people have to get over. But sorry, go ahead. You were going to cut you off.
Oh, so I think that's one aspect to it. And then also, like you were saying, just going through the reps, because a lot of times it's easy to test yourself on something once and do well and then think, okay, I'm all good. Like, I don't need to worry about this anymore. But especially like we did multiple mock interviews together. And so with a lot of those interviews, there might have been something I did well on the first time, but then in the second one, I stumbled on it. And so I think also that helps. And just, you kind of need to bruise your ego sometimes and recognize, okay, like I actually do really need to work on this particular thing more before I head into a real interview. So I think that aspect as well was what then allowed me at the end to go walk into those interviews, like you said, feeling very confident.
And what do you think what was most surprising, like out of the whole process from start to finish?
I think, and this is something that I didn't really fully appreciate until in retrospect, but the fact that a lot of my interviews, I think the reason that I came across so well was, again, just because of my ease with talking with people and my ability to kind of overcome that nervousness. Even if I had nervousness going into an interview, I was able to kind of shield that again with just like my enthusiasm and my excitement. And then I think on the other side of that also was how much it really, I think, came off in a positive way, that I was able to like kind of be myself in a way. And I know that's so cliche, but I think a lot of people will approach both the networking and then like the actual interview process in a way where they come off a lot more robotic than they actually are as people.
Transactional. Yeah, transactional.
Yes.
Like, hey, what are you going to give me? Like, can you pass my resume on? It's like, no, don't do that.
Right. Like you want to form personal connections with people. And I found that in the interviews that I walked away from where I felt so good afterwards, or where I felt the best afterwards, were the ones where we might have gone off on, like a 5-minute tangent at one point, talking about something completely non-finance related. I know in multiple of my interviews, I was just talking about books with my interviewers and like different things we had read recently. And I think that, I always tell people now when I'm helping underclassmen, make your interest section interesting and unique, because that it's things like that that will spark conversation in interviews where it will, you can step away for a moment, especially from like technical questions. And when you're able to have just a more like person to person conversation with your interviewer, they're going to walk away from that conversation with a better impression of you, even if it's on a subconscious level, just because you were able to make it less transactional, just a little more human.
Absolutely. So what were the results? Let's give the everyone kind of like, so you were coming into sophomore year. We kind of left off there to talk a little bit about overall, but you had you got into that program, the BlackStone program, but then you also had another offer, right?
Yeah. So I was going through the BlackStone recruiting process alongside the recruiting processes for several other banks, as well as a middle market private equity firm.
Mm-hmm.
And just because of how the timelines played out, it worked out that I had the offer from the middle market private equity firm, as well as the BlackStone offer, kind of right ahead of some super days I had scheduled at other banks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew that BlackStone was my top choice. I knew that was a role I really wanted. I knew I was super interested in doing private equity with that real estate focus. And so it worked out that I was able to then accept that BlackStone offer pretty soon after I received it. And I didn't end up having to interview or do super days at some of the banks that I had scheduled.
You had an offer and you did an internship at a bulge bracket at Citi, right?
Yes, my sophomore summer.
Your sophomore summer. And so did they give you an offer back, or how did that work?
Yeah, so I accepted the BlackStone offer actually before the Citi internship, because recruiting took place in the spring of my sophomore year, and then that Citi internship was the summer following.
Super early.
Yes, I was.
And so how did you approach the internship? Because that's not a guaranteed offer, right? So talk a little bit about that, because I think we continue to talk through that. You were still kind of my mentee. You still are technically my mentee, but I don't think you need much guidance now. But tell me a little bit about just like, what that process was leading up to the internship.
So I think then, especially after my Citi internship ended, which was a really good experience, and I learned a lot, of course, especially just being at a bulge bracket bank. The exposure I got was really good, even if it was just for a brief 10 weeks that summer. But then again, that experience also really validated my decision, I felt like, at the end, to go to BlackStone and to be doing real estate private equity there. So going into junior year, then I really just focused on preparing myself the best ways I could for that coming summer. Mm-hmm. And so that included kind of reaching out again to a few of the people who had interviewed me in the group, a few of the people that I had my super days with. I reached out to them to talk. And then I also was reaching out to a few other people in the group, as well as then kind of touching base again with a lot of the Fordham alumni that I had been speaking with as a freshman and as a sophomore, of Fordham alumni, different banks, and then as well as some older Fordham alumni who had done a few years of banking and are now on the buy side. And so I was, especially with those people, I was asking them for particular advice, because I was going into an internship on the buy side, just like if there was anything they thought I could do to prep for that aspect of it in particular. And that also included just like certain classes I took the spring of my junior year at Fordham that I felt like prepared me really well. So it was a lot of just trying to prepare myself. And then it wasn't as much like hard work, I would say. It was a lot of just like kind of longer deadlines, like, okay, over the next few months, I want to make sure like, I have coffee with certain people, or like I reach out, touch base with like kind of this list of people, get these and things like that. And then also just a lot of reading on my end of trying to make myself as up to date and as knowledgeable, just from like an industry background perspective as possible.
Yeah.
Which was something I think that helped me. And then going into the internship itself, then I felt like that helped a lot. And then in addition, again, like kind of the soft skills really came into play that I had built up over the last few years when it came to, meeting people. And then, of course, like being an intern in a very, somewhat large, intense environment, and just navigating that. And then finally, I found that my technical skills, I felt like, were really good coming into the internship. I was able to pick things up pretty easily from the modeling perspective, or at least more easily than I guess I had anticipated I would. So again, the kind of a combination of like the hard skills and the soft skills there.
For sure. I think all that kind of really what makes you such a strong candidate. And it doesn't surprise me that that's why you ended up with a full-time offer coming out of the internship. I mean, super congrats. It's a huge win. That's like paving a whole new way for Fordham. you'd be like, no, actually, I skipped investment banking. I went straight to the buy side. I'm going to private equity real estate. I remember asking you, like, are you sure this is what you want to do? Like, you want to go into real? You were like, yep, let's do it. And that was your top choice. You really like the people there, and I think that's what really matters. And yeah, you don't have to necessarily look back. I mean, you have basically your whole career ahead of you. Hopefully this senior year, you are enjoying yourself. I know before we hit record, you said you are. So hopefully
Yes.
you have a few more months of rest and relaxation. And again, super congrats. Really proud of everything you've done working with me, and then just all the hard work you put in yourself as well.
Thank you. And again, I look back, especially freshman year, all the help that you provided me definitely made such a substantial difference in kind of how my path unfolded. So we'll always be
Appreciate
grateful
that.
for that.
Appreciate that. Thanks, Chris. Talk soon.